Okay. All right, good evening and welcome to tonight's Extending Empathy Project Colloquium featuring Dr. Vanessa Hintz, who'll be talking tonight about racial identity development, the role of empathy in healing the cultural divide. I'm Dr. Nathan Carpenter from the School of Communication, where I serve as the Director of Convergent Media. I'll be managing tonight's technical program and helping moderate. And as you come up with any questions for Dr. Hintz tonight, if you are on Zoom, feel free to put those directly into the chat. As we continue through the night, if you find that it is easier to raise your hand and ask a question, please use the raise hand function in Zoom, and we will ask you to turn your mic on so that you can directly ask questions as needed. If you are joining us tonight on YouTube, feel free to type your questions and comments directly in the comment section on YouTube. There's a live chat, and we will get to your comments as soon as possible. There is about a 15 to 20-second delay, and so depending on when we see those comments, it might be a little behind where the conversation is, but we will make sure to get to you as soon as we can. So with that, I'd like to turn it over now to Dr. Scott Jordan, who will introduce the Extending Empathy Project.
Thank you, Dr. Carpenter. As he said, I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, Chair of the Department of Psychology here at Illinois State University. And on behalf of the faculty, students, and staff of the department, it's my sincere pleasure to welcome you to tonight's colloquium. You know, this project actually started in the fall of 2018 when I invited faculty and graduate students to participate in the project that would allow us to bring a more empathetic perspective to the college campus, as well as the community at large. To date, or excuse me, during our first year, we were able to present 10 colloquia. Last year, during the pandemic, that was reduced to 4. But then in June, particularly in June, let me get the date here, June 20th, Dr. Craig, Dr. Carpenter, and Dr. Hunt and I decided it would be important to program some alternative programming at 7 p.m. Central Time on that evening. So we were very fortunate to have Drs. Byron Craig and Steve Racco give the following talk: What should empathy be in this moment of historical reckoning? Reconciling Black trauma, whiteness, and the historical structure of racism since 1619. This was an extremely powerful talk. And as a matter of fact, the conversation from that talk is still continuing on the School of Communications Facebook page. And immediately following that talk, the 4 of us knew that we had to do another series this year that would ultimately take us to that talk. So this series, the Extending Empathy Project on the Road to Tulsa, is made up of 8 colloquia. 2 have been given so far. The first given by myself, in which I discussed whether or not we might want to consider measuring the quality of our empathy by the quality of the infrastructures we contribute to for everyone. And then last week, Dr. Leandra Paris talked about what it's like extending empathy to those who have been traumatized. Recordings of these talks, as well as all the upcoming talks, can be found on YouTube on the links that Dr. Carpenter has posted in the chat. So please feel free to download that flyer and send those links out to as many people as you can. The series picks up tonight with a 3rd colloquium and ends for the year with a talk given by Drs. Craig and Stephen Racco on Tuesday, June 1st, in commemoration of the Tulsa Massacre of 1921. And it's our hope that over the course of this series, we can collectively come to understand an approach to empathy that does not shy away from the hard, important choices we need to make in this culture about wealth, in equity and opportunity, and their relationship to diversity, inclusion, and justice. In addition, I'd like to give a quick shout out to our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Stephen Hunt, director of the School of Communication here at Illinois State University. Dr. Hunt is one of our collaborators on this project, and we look forward to having him back with the crew at our next colloquium. Now, it's usually at this point in the program where Dr. Hunt lets everybody know that this project is being endorsed by the American Democracy Project, which is a network of 296 state colleges and universities focused on public higher education's role in preparing the next generation of informed, engaged citizens for our democracy. The American Democracy Project was established in 2003 as a nonpartisan initiative of American Association of State Colleges and Universities in partnership with the New York Times. We thank the director of the American Democracy Project, Dr. Felice Noodleman, for her support of the Extending Empathy Project, and look forward to potentially bringing this curriculum to a national audience next year in collaboration with the American Democracy Project. We hope you'll attend the remaining colloquia in the series, join the conversation, spread the word, and help us extend a grounded resources-informed approach to empathy to a larger and larger audience. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce my dear friend and colleague from the School of Communication here at Illinois State University, Dr. Byron Craig.
Thank you, Dr. Jordan. So it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Hintz is a licensed clinical psychologist who received her doctorate in clinical psychology from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. She works with children, adolescents, and adults with a wide array of presenting issues. She has extensive training in working with individuals who have been exposed to traumatic experiences, those with co-occurring substance use issues, as well as those struggling with emotional regulation. Dr. Hintz works actively to achieve understanding of each person's unique circumstances, all while ensuring one's individual values and beliefs are respected within the therapeutic relationship. She believes the ultimate goal of therapy is to empower individuals to confront problematic circumstances in their lives and to work collaboratively toward furthering health and wellness. Dr. Hintz is an active proponent of multicultural counseling and theory and works dynamically to understand how individuals make meaning of the world within their various cultural contexts. Dr. Hintz is also a self-proclaimed geek therapist and incorporates elements of popular culture into treatment and training when beneficial. Dr. Hintz has been a contributing author to 2 different books in the popular culture psychology series, including Black Panther Psychology, Hidden Kingdoms, and The Joker Psychology, Evil Clowns and the Women Who Love Them. In addition to working as an assistant professor of community psychology at Alverno College, Dr. Hintz maintains a private practice at Cornerstone Counseling Services in Milwaukee. She is also the founder of Vivid Insights, which utilizes expertise in psychology and human behavior to provide consultation focused on principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Dr. Hintz is also an active member of the Wisconsin Psychological Association, where she currently serves on the board of directors and is the chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Dr. Hintz became a member of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated, a proud Black Greek organization, in the spring of 2006. She was initiated into the Delta Theta chapter at the University of Louisville and is currently an active member of the Kappa Beta Zeta graduate chapter in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Vanessa Hintz.
Thank you so much, Dr. Craig. Thank you, Dr. Jordan. Thank you, Illinois State University, for allowing me to be here this evening and to bring this very important discussion to us all. So I'm going to speak for a little bit, and then I hope that after I'm finished, we can all just have a wrap session and sort of talk about whatever comes up for you. Like a therapist, I'm going to invite you all to be cognizant and pay attention to your feelings and anything that comes up for you in the course of our conversation, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because I think it's all valuable and it's all important. So I'm going to try to do something fancy here. Can people see my slides next to my face? Okay, awesome. So this is how I'm going to talk to you all. There will be a couple times where sadly my face will go away. There's going to be one time where we watch a video, and then we will be doing some interactive polling here at the beginning. So if you're on a computer, if you have just like another tab open, to be able to type in, your responses, or if you have a phone, anything with an internet browser, you can utilize. So without further ado, I'm going to talk to you all today about racial identity development, specifically how empathy and understanding racial identity can help us to be a more equitable and inclusive society. So first, I'm going to do a whole bunch of introductions and a whole bunch of context setting because I'm a therapist and that's what I do. I also think that that's important because I never want to assume that anyone's reality is the same as mine. So I'm going to go through and set a whole bunch of context here. First and foremost, though, I'm sorry, I know this text is very small, but I just want to pay homage to the First Nations. I'm here in Milwaukee, which is the traditional homeland of the Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and Potawatomi peoples. So I want to just lift them up and ask for wisdom and honor from them in our conversation today, and really just make mention of the atrocities that were done to these first peoples, and that we are all benefiting from that by being on these lands. So again, I just wanted us to take a moment to honor that. I know that a lot of you all are coming from Illinois State, so this is the land acknowledgement from Illinois State. I didn't want to be remiss and not include that as well. So again, I just want us all to sort of embrace that spirit as we move forward. So this is what we're going to do this evening. Again, we're going to talk, it's basically going to be two parts of the conversation this evening. First, talking more specifically about racial identity, racism, intergenerational trauma, privilege, and then just some models of racial identity development, both for minority identified individuals as well as for white individuals. And then we're going to talk more specifically about empathy, so feelings, and sort of how that can, again, help us, even though it's uncomfortable at times, sort of try to come together and heal a lot of our divide. In addition, before starting, I always want to pay homage to those individuals that we lost at the hands of police brutality. So it's interesting because I started doing these talks last summer, and the amount that this list has grown in a year is unsettling. And so again, I want to lift these people up, lift their names up, and pay homage to them because in some weird, sick, sad way, because of their deaths, we're here having this conversation right now. So again, I want to just pay homage and honor to those individuals that we lost. What I also want to do is just sort of like the last piece of context setting is introduce myself to you all, because again, I think it's important for you to understand where I'm coming from, where I'm speaking from, sort of what influences my opinions, everything I'm going to say. So I'll start. I don't know if you all can see my cursor. You probably can't, but I'm going to start in this middle picture here. With me at my doctoral level graduation. Those are my parents. Okay, they're cute. So I am a biracial woman of color. I identify as a Black woman. Over here to the right of that center picture, that's me and my husband. We cute. My husband is white. I'm in an interracial marriage in the year of 2021, which I think is, it would have been interesting in 1982, but I think it's even more so interesting now. Moving, this would be counterclockwise. So I'm sure you all see all these nerdy pictures over here. As Dr. Craig said, I lean into that. I'm a nerd. I don't know if you can see, you can't see because it's covered up by the slides, but I have all my Funko Pops behind me. Like that, I live this life and that's my life. And I value pop culture and I value nerdness. And again, I lean into it. As I mentioned, I think just being a doctoral level educated Black woman is an entire culture in itself, and just being in so many spaces that are just permeated, that are whiteness permeates those spaces, I think just is an interesting experience. Any Black faculty member can talk to you about that. I'm a millennial through and through, very loud and proud millennial. I know we get shaded a lot for a lot of stuff, but it's not all us. So I'm a millennial. And then lastly, I like to include these pictures here because I both love food and love fitness, and I have not yet found the balance between those things. Usually it's too much food, not enough fitness, but you know, I'm working on it. I'm working on it. So that's where I'm coming from. That's me. And again, I just wanted to set that context. So again, when you hear me use terms like we, them, us, me, this is the context from which I'm speaking. So the other thing I like to just point out at the beginning of all of the discussions I do about race and racism is that these are deeply personal matters, right? Like what we're talking about can be triggering, what we're talking about can make people feel emotional. And so I like to point out that feelings, like a therapist, I'm going to tell you, feelings are okay, even the ones that are uncomfortable. So feeling angry, feeling upset is healthy and can be healing. What is not always healing is being verbally abusive. I would deign to say being disrespectful. Those things are not always beneficial to the conversation. So I'm just asking that we sort of adopt those group norms for ourselves when we're going through these conversations. And a lot of what we talk about today, again, can be uncomfortable, most often for, the majority population, i.e. white people. And so I want to, at the outset, say, white people are not the enemies that we're talking about. The enemies and the sort of things we need to dismantle are these systems, sort of unjust and racist systems. And so, white society is not the enemy. The enemy is racism. The enemy is white supremacy. The enemy is, ethnocentrism. I also feel like I always need to say this, but people of color are not immune from bias. Other marginalized peoples are not immune from bias. So I think as we're going through this, again, I think we all sort of have to check our biases and our assumptions as we're moving through. And also understand that we're all sort of intersectional beings. So you saw all of my different intersections that I sort of went through. So I would also invite you all to reflect on that as we're going through as well, and understand that we can't negate those intersectional pieces. Whew, okay, that was all the context setting. So what we're gonna do now is, this is the part where we're gonna get interactive. So allow me one moment just to get my screen together. So hopefully everyone can see this screen. So this is an interactive poll. Sorry, let me move that. Everyone can see this? There's a blue screen with a question on it. Okay, so with whatever device you have, if you go to slido.com, slido.com, it's gonna ask you for an event code, and our event code this evening is 58021. So I just want you all to just throw in there, what do you feel like are the primary barriers to discussing issues of race? What makes that difficult for us? And this is a word cloud. So as people put, this is also totally anonymous. So as people type in their responses, it will show up here. And those things that are bigger are the ones that show up more often. So kudos to that first person. Thank you. Proud of you. Thank you so much. Awesome. Yes, guilt. Discomfort. Keep them coming, y'all. I don't know how many people are here, so I don't know how many responses we're waiting for, but we'll just give it another minute or so because we do have one more question. But I feel like a lot of this stuff we're actually gonna, get to in the conversation. So who said infrastructure? Okay, then yes. Not knowing many people. Victim mentality, come through. People not listening. Okay, yes. I love that we have an array of answers and none of the words are like big. So this is like, this is my virtual attempt to read the room. So I thank you all so much. Rampant individualism. Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. We'll give it just about another minute or so, and then we'll move on to question 2. So I'm seeing a theme here. See, ignorance. Now that's the theme. I'm seeing a theme of ignorance, guilt, being unsure of how to proceed, what to say, being fearful of saying something that's incorrect. Absolutely. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next question for the sake of time. So I appreciate you all in your participation there. Hold on, sorry. Blah. Okay. So can you all now see this poll? What do you hope to gain from our discussion today? Is that now available, hopefully, to everyone? There we go, boom. What do you hope to gain from our discussion today? Yes, understanding. Mm, mm, mm. Get my heart churned. Man, I'm gonna churn some heart. Yes, whoever wrote that. I'm gonna try my hardest. Yes. Real discuss. Yes. Hmm. Insight. That's what I do. That's what we do as therapists. So yes. Insights. Self. This is bringing me feels, y'all. I'm excited. Mm-hmm. We're gonna give it about another minute or so. Thank you all again for your participation. I really appreciate it. Insights agency. These are therapy treatment goals. I love it. Awesome. Greater comfort. Listening. Yes, listening. Awesome. So you all, as you continue to respond as you see fit. Because if you stay in the Slido as people respond, you'll be able to see what they say. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this and get back to sort of like the presentation piece of it. So again, thank you so much. I appreciate your participation there. So we're going to continue on then and get into the meat of our discussion. Let me just make sure I'm on my right screen. Okay, cool. So, okay. Again, what we're going to talk about first, we're going to sort of talk more specifically about racial identity. And in so doing, I think we have to talk about the history of race and racism in America. And so that's kind of where we'll start. And then, like I said, move into talking about centering the conversation less on oppression and more on privilege and sort of whiteness. And then we'll talk about some of those racial identity development models. So first and foremost, I think it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, that racism is just embedded in our society since our country's very inception. It's everywhere all the time. It's pervasive. I don't think there's any way, shape, or form it's not infused into every aspect of American society, which is depressing and disheartening, I think. But having an awareness of that is important, right? And I think it's also important to understand research shows how racist the educational system is. And we're talking not just K through 12, but higher education and beyond. So think about the fact that every child in America is mandated to go to school. So you think about students of color and students from other marginalized groups are sort of mandated to exist in these spaces that are not made for them, that are hostile towards them, that are derogatory towards them. And in so doing, students in these spaces are from a very young age made aware of the fact that they're different, made aware of the fact that they will be treated differently, and that they're not often going to be valued or treated justly. So again, I think that those are things that are, again, just deeply embedded, deeply rooted into the everyday fabric of our society. Now, when we talk about systemic racism, that's exactly what we're pointing to, right? Is the fact that the very logic that dictates day-to-day life in America is racist. It's inherently racist, and it's built on both capitalism and white supremacy. Capitalism, that's a discussion for a different day that we just do not have time for today. But the very fabric of our institutions is rooted in white supremacist ideals, which again, is just very depressing to say out loud. But I don't want to assume, but I think people of color understand like what it is to just be and confront these systems on a day-to-day basis. And so I do think, though, what is also important to understand, because again, nothing I'm saying is new. We didn't just find this out yesterday, right? This is something that has been happening since forever. And so I think it's important to really acknowledge why we have been so stagnant for so long. And I will say for so long, because I feel like the amount of strides we made, proportion to the atrocities and trauma that we suffered, it's just not even almost equal. So I think that the space that we're in now is that there's this expectation that when we have these conversations, we'll be, we won't be too harsh. This idea of respectability politics, and we'll make our conversations palatable. because if not, we're just going to be seen as, angry, oppressed peoples. We can't be militant. We can't pull a Malcolm. You know what I'm saying? We have to be more calm. And I think that very that understanding or that belief is what has led us to this place of stagnation, is that everybody's trying to be nice and nobody wants to rock the boat when the boat needs to just be tipped over. So again, I think that in conversations that I have and in all of these discussions and trainings that I do, I don't ever want to shame anyone, make anyone feel shameful or guilty. I also don't want to sugarcoat the truth, for lack of a better word, to make people feel comfortable, because again, that is an agent of privilege. Because for people of color, there is no sugarcoating, because it happens every day, all the time. And so, again, I think when we think about sort of like I mentioned, sort of like those years of oppression and these little years of the little stride, I don't want to devalue it, but the strides that we made proportion to the trauma that we've suffered there's just no comparison, right? And so when we talk about intergenerational trauma, we're talking about trauma that's inflicted on a group of people who share a specific identity or affiliation. And intergenerational trauma not only affects us biologically, so it actually changes our genetic sequence. It affects the way that we're socialized. It affects our psychological responses. And so intergenerational trauma for Black Americans, started with being brought over and being enslaved. For Native Americans, it started with the erasure and the erasure of their culture and this sort of obliteration and genocide. And so the intergenerational trauma, how many people here have heard somebody say slavery was so long ago? Okay, but the effects are still felt. I know that you didn't own slaves, but your peoples did, and I still feel that. I still have effects of that. The way that children are reared, like Black and brown children are reared, are influenced by intergenerational traumas. And so there are a couple examples of intergenerational trauma that are, out in literature that I just want to, make you all aware of. There's one book written by a friend of mine, Dr. Maisa Akbar, called Urban Trauma. And it basically outlines this legacy of inequity and racism in America and how that affects people, Black and brown peoples today. And so, as I mentioned, a lot of the trauma that we're experiencing today is the result of this sort of 400-year fight for equity and justice. And so I can't do the same thing for a week without results, let alone 400 years. So think about the way that makes people feel, that I'm fighting for the same things that my great ancestors fought for. You know what I'm saying? And I think when we recenter this in education, as we were talking about before, with regard to, how racist and sort of whitewashed the education system is, we have teachers and educators being called on to basically help children to deal with this trauma when they themselves may, one, be inflicting the trauma, but also may be unable to, may not have this understanding of sort of the impact of intergenerational trauma. So typically what we see in individuals who sort of are dealing with urban trauma is this ever-present anger. So again, thinking about the fact that we're marching the same way they marched how many years ago for the same stuff, that would make anyone angry. And so again, when we see people of color, like what we saw last summer, rioting, uprisings, looting, I don't even want to say looting, burning stuff, that is anger from this unfinished equal rights agenda. So again, this is a text I would absolutely recommend to anybody who's interested in sort of understanding more about this framework. Absolutely recommend that book. Another one is Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy. And so she similarly outlines the impacts of intergenerational trauma on Black Americans, which she harkens back to the atrocities of enslavement. And so even the way that Black children are reared, the way that Black families are, the things that we value, the way our families are structured, all of that, she argues, harkens back to, that sort of intergenerational transmission of trauma due to enslavement. And so she points out different patterns of behavior as well that we often see in Black Americans because of this sort of intergenerational trauma. Vacant esteem, ever-present anger, and then racist socialization. So again, this is a book I would highly recommend if you're at all interested in intergenerational trauma. It's very easy. It's a quick read. I think it's something that she puts in a way that's easy to understand. She also has a lot of anecdotes in there too, which are really deep and powerful. So if anyone is interested, absolutely, that's a book I would recommend with regard to intergenerational trauma. And so what we're going to do now is sort of, like I said, shift the focus from discussing oppression to discussing the oppressors, and sort of like what has maintained these systems of oppression over time. And I think one thing that is important to understand, we talk about white privilege often, we talk about issues of white supremacy. And so I like to frame this in this sort of, with this lens of ethnocentric multiculturalism, which developed by Dr. Darrell Sue and colleagues. But ostensibly, this is the sort of underlying framework that maintains these systems, and it's made up of these 5 different components. The first 4 being just exactly what they sound like. So belief in the superiority of a dominant group. When Columbus discovered America, he was like, yeah, we're gonna go ahead and take this. That's because he just felt like he could. You know what I'm saying? When, when Europeans enslaved Africans, because they felt like they could, because they felt like they were better. So the belief in the superiority of the dominant group, which in turn, I think just logically, you have this belief in the inferiority of all others. So we're great, everybody else sucks. There's also this power to impose standards. So if I hear one more person say something about reverse racism, this is what I'm going to point them to, because again, reverse racism is not a thing because no one else but white people has the power to impose standards. And so, yes, white people can be discriminated against. There can be prejudicial behavior towards white people. There cannot be racism because, again, racism has that sort of power piece in it, the power to impose standards. And again, as we mentioned before, the manifestation in institutions, so that systemic piece of it, right? So it's everywhere, it's inescapable. It's not just in school, it's not just at the bank, it's not just at the grocery store, it's not just walking down the street, it's not just using a counterfeit $20 bill, it's everywhere. And then this last component of ethnocentric multiculturalism is what we call the invisible veil, which is this idea that the people in the majority culture have that everybody shares their experience. So what are you talking about? The whole lift yourself up by the bootstraps meritocracy situation. Like, if I did it, why can't you? You need to just try harder. That's the invisible veil, assuming that everyone has the same experience, which for so many reasons is just a faulty way of thinking about things. But particularly when we're talking about issues of oppression and privilege, is just not serving anyone. So this entire idea of ethnocentric multiculturalism is, I would argue, what maintains systems of oppression in America. So we're now going to transition to watching a spoken word piece, and I'm sure some of you have seen this because it sort of was all on social media recently, but it's a spoken word piece about white privilege. I will warn people there are curse words. I think there's an F word and an N word. So if you feel at all uncomfortable, I invite you to just mute. I just wanted to throw that out there because it's deep. And I invite you all to listen if you feel like you can, but I also don't want to offend anyone. So can you all see this here? Okay, cool.
We learned your French. We learned your English, we learned your Spanish, we learned your Dutch, your Portuguese, your German. You learned our nothing, you called us stupid. That's white privilege. And I'm sure it probably hurts for you to hear those 2 words, kind of like gunshots and explosions from those commissioned to protect you with whisking past your ears. What is white privilege? It is the only 5 decades of legal acknowledgement expected to correct 400 years of white transgression. It is crack versus cocaine. Blacks receiving almost 20% longer sentences for the same exact offenses. Like, for instance, a black man without a record is less likely to get a job than a white felon, or maybe it's because we're lazy and we don't work hard enough. Like, what the fuck? 400 years in the same field literally is an incredible resume builder. It is Katrina answering the government's prayers of eugenics, Dick Cheney going fishing the next day, Condoleezza on a shopping spree, Bush in San Diego, but Kanye is the one you call crazy because like it only took the USA 2 days to get aid to Asia, but 5 for FEMA to get to Canal Street and Esplanade. It is the one black kid who beat the shit out of the odds, but only thanks to Sandra Bullock, Michelle Pfeiffer, and the White Shadow, so now we all can make it. It is the only time thousands of white people are cheering for the black kid to win. It is in the stadium. It is you looking at me crazy if I told you to go back to Europe, even though we didn't have a say. It is you all of a sudden having a problem with immigration like this isn't even your nation. How the hell do you discover some shit that wasn't even missing to begin with? You Columbus our traditions. Had white girls twerking in high definition with multicolored hair and purple nails, but it was ghetto when we did it. Oh, I make you uncomfortable. Try a cramped slave ship, but wait, slavery is over now. It's just called the prison system because like you're not racist because you don't use the N-word, but y'all use niggas every day. What is white privilege? It is the acceptance of bombs over Baghdad but not over Boston. It is European history being taught as a major and African as an elective. It is learning about my people only 28 days like I'm not black every fucking second as every white boy. With the fuck my brains out, not because I'm pretty, but because I'm pretty for a black girl. It is people thinking that Africa is one nation. It is the waving of the Confederate flag like you didn't lose the battle and then telling us to get over slavery. It is people saying that black people destroyed neighborhoods, but forgetting that white people have destroyed continents. It is every time I bring up my plight, some white man has to tell me that I'm crazy, but is kind enough to praise my English or say that we're all given the same opportunities, even though he has a family history of wealth, and I don't even know my family history at all. Is the justification of police brutality. Like, what did that person do? I'm sure it doesn't hurt as much when the victim doesn't look like you. It is people thinking that affirmative action is an unfair advantage instead of keeping the qualified from being unfairly disadvantaged or throwing out a qualified applicant because their name sounded too African American. Is Newports imported into black communities, but black boys exported for weed as big plastic asses that are called fat when we naturally have them. It is an Australian woman whose new classic of rap music is everyone who hears this poem dismisses all this truth I just spit as reverse racism. That is white privilege. Thank you.
I hope y'all heard her. I hope y'all felt that. I love using that piece. I think it's very powerful. I think it's very poignant. So again, you can't see it, sorry, because of my lights, but I would absolutely be happy to share that, the link to that video. But I think, again, that is just, again, she sort of touched on everything we talked about to this point: systemic racism, intergenerational trauma, ongoing injustice. So we're gonna move on now. And again, I'm gonna invite everyone to just sort of take in a breath and reflect on how you feel in this moment. And again, just hold that and just sit with that as we move forward in the conversation. So we're gonna transition now to talking about racial identity development and center that conversation initially on whiteness. This is something that I'm fond of saying. This is something I truly believe. The fight for equity, I think, needs to be centered on whiteness, because I firmly believe racism is a problem for white people to solve. It's not for people of color to solve, because it's like victim blaming. Like, why we got to solve something we didn't even do? So I feel like more of these conversations, it's my goal to sort of have more of these conversations centered around the dynamic of whiteness. And I think one thing that's unique about whiteness is that, like, sort of what we talked about with the invisible veil, right? Oftentimes people don't think about what it means to be white, because white is just associated with normality, with the baseline, with the status quo. And so people don't typically think about that. And so because they don't think about that, they don't often think about privilege or, their place in these oppressive systems. And so I think it's important to understand, just like we inherit intergenerational trauma, I think it's almost impossible for white people to not inherit those biases just because of the nature of the world that we live in. And that's not to mean that you have to go through your whole world biased. You go through your whole life biased. I think it means that you have to work doubly hard to counteract those biases. And that's, to me, what the entire book of White Fragility is getting at, by Robin DiAngelo. So that's another book that I would highly recommend. It's, understanding that innately, white people are racist because that's the type of system that we live in. And she talks a lot about sort of removing that good, bad, racist, non-racist dichotomy and just accepting that, like, yep, America's like racist as hell. And so we just sort of, how we're born into that, we inherit that. It doesn't make you a bad person. You just, well, some people are bad people, but that doesn't inherently make you a bad person. So this is one, there are many, but this is one of the most popular models of white racial identity development, developed by Helms. And so again, there's this assumption that racism is innate. And so the entirety of the identity development model goes through 6 stages that are broken up into 2 different phases. The first phase being abandoning racism, and the next phase moving towards a non-racist identity, right? And so that involves ostensibly people coming to realize, like, dang, oppression is real, and getting to a place where they really understand these systems of oppression and privilege and all of that, and getting to a place where you sort of are like, oh, my whole world is rocked, now that I understand things. And so from there, there's this sort of dissonance, and then people, they put themselves back together and decide that they don't want to be a part, they don't want to influence these systems. They don't want to be actively oppressive. So then you move through this whole second stage of the model where you really work to develop a non-racist and eventually anti-racist identity. So I don't know if there's a slide, so I'm just going to say it now, but non-racism versus anti-racism. Non-racism is an ideology. It's understanding oppression and privilege and actively saying, I ain't gonna do that. Like, no, I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna be a good white person. I'm not gonna be racist. Where anti-racism takes that one step further and puts that into action. Because I would argue, we're not gonna get anywhere without more anti-racist white folks. Action. And again, that action doesn't mean marching in the streets. Action looks different for all people, right? I wasn't marching in the streets with COVID, and like, no, thank you. I feel like my lane is elsewhere. And so I think for you all, as you start to think about, again, and we're going to get to talking about empathy very soon, as you think about your place in this, think about what you feel like your lane is with regard to anti-racism. Because again, for some people it is organizing. For some people it's educating. Like people who are educators in the audience, sometimes it's being mindful of your syllabi and what are you teaching? To be mindful of the students that are in your class. Do they feel welcome? Is it inclusive? So on the flip side, this is a minority identity development model developed by, again, Daryl Stu and colleagues, which ostensibly goes through a similar process, right? Where we start out in this sort of conformity space where people are sort of distancing themselves from their minority identity. So like, no, I'm just gonna be like everybody else, i.e. white. I'm just gonna be normal. I'm gonna do what everybody else does, i.e. I'm gonna be white. And then something happens, usually it's sort of race-related trigger, race-related event that pushes people into this space of dissonance. For example, what happened over this past summer with the George Floyd video, just being everywhere all the time, which was just vicariously traumatic. That is a race-related event that can push minority-identified individuals into a place of dissonance, trying to make sense of why did that happen to him? And you realize it's racism. And so that pushes us into a place of dissonance where we're sort of like, whoa, I'm different. White people are treated differently than I am. What am I going to do with that? And so what we then move into following dissonance is what we call resistance and immersion. So that's where you sort of go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, fully immersed in your minority identity and just don't want anything to do with any of the white people, like just throw them all away. That's pretty much how people feel in this stage. And I should have sort of made this caveat at the beginning. This is not a linear process. I think people just go back and forth and all over throughout their lifetimes, nor do I think there's any one stage that is ideal. I think that is absolutely dependent on the person. So after you're sort of in this resistance and emergence stage, like, you know what, I'm just gonna be over here by myself. I'm just gonna be kicking it. You go through another sort of dissonance stage where it's like, maybe this is not cool because I have to interact with some white people and some white people are cool. So like that goes against this firmly held belief that I have that like all white people are trash and we should throw them away. So you get into this sort of second introspective phase. And then ultimately we move into what we call integrative awareness, where you can integrate both sort of like your minority identity development with all of this understanding about oppression and privilege and understand your what you can control in that and what is not your responsibility, and sort of work collaboratively with allies to sort of like, so that's the process of minority identity development. I have a picture here of T'Challa and Killmonger because I feel like in the Black Panther film, they so perfectly, displayed this sort of like two different paths to minority identity development. We see Killmonger very deeply rooted in that resistance and immersion stage, like he was ready to just blow everybody up. And so we see T'Challa sort of like go through a lot of these different stages. But I think ultimately at the end, when he's sort of opening up Wakanda to the world, we see him in this integrative awareness stage. So that's minority identity development. And again, follows a similar sort of path as, white identity development, also very distinct. So we're going to transition now into talking about empathy, and I promise we're going to have discussion. So this will be very quick. So what I want to talk to you all a little bit about is emotional intelligence, sort of just outlining what that is and how it plays a role in racial justice. And then talking a little bit about cultural humility, which is very different than cultural competence. And I'll talk to you about why that is. Oh my gosh, this text is so small, but I'm going to try to just do a quick overview for you all. So emotional intelligence essentially is your ability to not only understand your own emotions, but to recognize the emotions in others and sort of be productive in those spaces with that. So like I have to know what I'm feeling and kind of be attuned to what you're feeling as well and understand how those things interact. And you can see how with what we just talked about with regard to racial identity development, understanding where you are in sort of your own racial identity, how that would influence the spaces, how that would influence the way you interpret others' emotions, how that would influence the way you experience emotions, right? And so emotional intelligence sort of has these 5 core competencies, which on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how you can assess for those. And all of these are exactly what they sound like. Self-awareness, empathy, and motivation. And when we talk about motivation in the emotional intelligence sense, we're talking about intrinsic motivation. So not those external things that motivate you, but what motivates you internally. What are those things that really get you, going in a productive space or make you feel good? Self-regulation and also social skills. So this is another, I'm just going to invite everyone to reflect on this. As you're thinking about your own levels of emotional intelligence, which I also think vary from context to context, from situation to situation. So I'm just going to read some of these questions. And again, I sort of invite you all to sort of just take a moment, take a pause, and think about how you would respond. So in assessing your self-awareness, what emotions do you feel like you would like to be more aware of as they're happening? So those emotions that you experience, like after you sort of come down off that emotional high, you're like, dang, why did I do that? What is going on? That would be assessing your self-awareness. Similarly, self-regulation, what emotions do you experience that you feel are most disruptive to your life? Those ones that, like when I'm X, I ain't doing nothing else for the rest of the day. Motivation, again, intrinsically, what emotions do you feel like motivate you to be your best? What are those things that drive you? I don't know if this is an emotion, but my example is whenever someone tells me I can't do something, oh, bet I'm going to do that and I'm going to do it well. That's not an emotion, I guess, but whatever. That's how I would answer that question. Empathy, which is what we're all sort of here to discuss. How well do you feel like you're able to recognize someone else's emotional state? And I would say empathy moves beyond recognition and validation, because validation is like, I see you. Oh, yeah, I see you. I think empathy, true empathy, is felt. It's not a cognitive experience, it's felt. And so I think that's why it's very difficult to describe what it is, because like, how do you describe love? How do you describe happiness? Empathy is felt. I think what recognizing someone's emotion is a validation. Empathy is a feeling. It's a vibe. And then lastly, sort of assessing your social skills. What emotions do you feel like support you in social situations? I think those can be work situations and otherwise, just any sort of relational, person to person, interpersonal activity. And which of the emotions do you feel like hinder you? Like, again, when I feel this way, I ain't doing nothing. So again, there's 1,001 emotional intelligence quizzes you could take online. There's a lot of work being done with regard to emotional intelligence and job satisfaction, particularly for educators. So if anybody's interested, I got all the citations, all the references. And so, oh my gosh, my face is covered up. So what this means with regard to racial justice is, again, you think about that sort of self-awareness piece, thinking about being aware of your assumptions and how they influence the way that you interact with others, right? So how do you view difference? How do you view, like, you know, race relations, all of that? What are your assumptions? What are your stereotypes? And again, I don't ever want to assert that anyone is free of assumption, because I don't think that that's true. I think that like neurobiologically, that's not true. We all sort of look at things and we try to categorize them. But being aware of those things is what's going to help us move towards a more equitable and just society. And acknowledging how we live out sort of these assumptions in everyday life. All of that, I think, is are components of emotional intelligence: self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy, motivation, all of those things. Okay, so last thing we're going to talk about before we move into our discussion is this idea of cultural humility. So I think it's important to understand, because again, I think it's often very easy to fall into thinking about all the things that separate us and not thinking about those things that bring us together, right? And so I like this sort of 3 concentric circle model of identity. And so in the middle, the innermost circle, you have those things that are unique to you. Nobody else has those things. Moving out one level, you have group level similarities and differences, right? So there are going to be certain things that I share with people who share as the same identity as me, you know, like Black women, educated people, whatever. There's going to be things that we share, and there's going to be things that are different. That outermost circle, the outermost circle that you see, those are things that we all share just existentially as human beings. And so when we're thinking about building bridges, when we're thinking about connecting with folk, no matter how different they may appear, there's always a bridge of connection to be drawn. And I think that's what we learn as therapists. When we're trying to connect with people, if, you know, we sort of try to connect on those existential pieces. And so I just suffice all that to say, I think, again, we talked a lot this evening about differences and all of that. But again, there's always something that I think can connect us. I knew there was a slide. I already talked about this, so I'm going to keep going. The difference between non-racism and anti-racism, because I want to move on into talking about allyship. So what does it mean to be a white racial ally? And I think at its very core, allyship is recognizing that you have privilege that you were born into and utilizing that privilege to further justice. So again, it's not just about being non-racist and understanding your privilege. It's about moving into the space of action. And again, we are not going to get anywhere without white allies. We're just not, because of the power dynamics. Like, all of the marginalized peoples in America could rise up. We still need white people. We still need white people to come, because white people hold all the power. And so this is just this is an allyship model that I appreciate. Again, a good friend of mine, Dr. Maisa Akbar, wrote this book called Beyond Ally. And I appreciate her allyship model because she really goes into detail about the difference between like saviorism, which is not allyship, like just coming in and being like, you should just do what we do and it'll be fine. No, that's saviorism, and that's not helpful to anyone. She argues that what we should be striving toward is what she calls equity brokering, which is ostensibly what we saw in that definition, right? It's white people utilizing their privilege to bring people of color into spaces, and then white people just going away. Like, bring me to the table, but then you just go away and you don't have to say anything, because again, you can't speak to my experience. And so another book that I would highly recommend, because it definitely walks you through like journal prompts and reflections and all of those things. So the last thing I'll leave you all with before we move to discussion, oh my gosh, you can hardly see that, but these are, if someone can, I can copy that citation down so I can send you the link to this article, but these are just 10 keys to everyday racism, or anti-racism, excuse me. And you'll see that empathy is on this list. Absolutely. So empathy undoubtedly plays a role in our pursuit for racial justice. And I think these other things that we see on this list here are things that we talked about, right? Anti-racism, being knowledgeable of your emotions. There's so many emotions on this list. And again, I think that so often we focus on systems and putting systems into play, and we don't like confront those underlying attitudes that have maintained inequitable systems over time. And so I think, yes, we need to focus on the systems, and we need to focus on our own emotional intelligence and our own biases and assumptions. Okay, I'm sorry, this is the last thing. So I can absolutely provide this to be sent out to everyone, but this is just a resource list that I developed with regards to things that you can read, watch, or listen to. If you vibed with anything that I was saying and you want to read more, there are also a plethora of other lists that you could just Google. But if you really want to start engaging in this sort of work and really show up empathically for marginalized and oppressed peoples, I think you just have to put in that work and really become knowledgeable, not just reading, watching, listening, but experientially, once it's safe to do so, experientially, surrounding yourself with people that are not like you. With that is all I have prepared, so I'm absolutely 100% open to questions, comments, and concerns at this time. I'm also going to take this off so you can see me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vanessa. We've got 3 already in the chat, and I'll go back and go to the first one that's there. So the first question asks, to what degree do most white people know the history of their European ancestry, since they too have been assimilated into a melting pot, lost language and customs and all of that as well?
To be honest, I have no idea. I definitely think that there is an advantage to tracing European ancestry as opposed to African ancestry, because I think that just documentation, for lack of a better word, was very different. And so I am unsure. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. But yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I think that there's just a difference in tracing those different lineages. And I think that I would never want to argue that assimilation was like not terrible, and like losing those cultures and customs was not terrible. I will say though that it is an absolutely different experience than sort of like enslavement and what our African ancestors sort of endured, and how that was just sort of like tracing. She kind of said that in the piece, right? I don't know my history. I don't know how to trace that, and I don't know anybody that does. You know what I'm saying? Good question.
The second question we have in the comments actually comes from Byron, so he might follow up here as well, Dr. Craig. And he says, I wonder how you might talk about race lighting with racial identity development. And then how does or can this work alongside empathy and racial empathy?
You said race lighting?
Race lighting, yeah.
So,
I'm afraid of that term.
Yeah, it's a relatively new term, but really what it's talking about is kind of the ways that kind of how Black folk have to now deal with this notion of it's similar to ethnic notions, right? So when we think about the history of representation of Black folk in the media, right, historically, and so now this term being coined that looks at this notion of how we question our own thoughts and actions based on these kind of representations and the kind of racialized messages that we've been, that we get. Like for instance, when you talked about, this notion of, well, that's not a good example, but just kind of if we think about the images that we've seen, right? But now the kind of discourse, the narratives that we might hear about Blackness, right? So I think it's just another level of that's impounded on us about, that can drag us down, right? That can make us feel traumatized, right? More. So, and I know, and I've been seeing this term kind of popping up. It's kind of a new term that's popping up, I think, so.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm actually working on a project now that almost like it's about that exact thing that you just said. So how these racist narratives that we see and just sort of the way we see marginalized people represented is a form of vicarious trauma. So why every time I see myself on TV, is it in a jumpsuit? Is it, again, at Sandra Bullock's house because she took me out to get it? Like whatever, like what? That is a vicarious trauma. And I think that is something, again, that sort of lends itself to that ever-present anger that we talked about, because it's like, you cannot escape it. I can't watch TV. I can't walk down the street. I can't go to school. I can't go to work. There's like very few places where marginalized and oppressed peoples can really be authentically and wholly themselves. We didn't really talk about code switching today, but that's a whole other conversation we could get into, right? Code switching for marginalized folks is a means of survival. Like if I didn't do that, where would I be? You know what I'm saying? And so I think that that is just that's sort of those representations in the media are just they're just vicarious trauma and just yet another way that again we're stereotyped and reduced to these just negative images. I wouldn't even say negative, just like images again that can be traumatic because I don't want to put evaluation on it. Good question.
All right, we have another question in the comments, or in the chat, I should say. How do you deal with leadership that has white privilege and they don't appear authentic in addressing racism and inequity in the workplace?
I'm sorry, I laughed. I laughed because it's just like my plight. Because I think that particularly since what happened last summer, we've seen a lot of what we call performative allyship. So people saying like, yeah, we're gonna do these things. And then either the things don't get done or like you do a thing. And I think that that goes back to what I sort of briefly mentioned at the end here, which is like, okay, you can think about racism existing on these 4 different levels, right? We have the personal level, which is just me and all like my ideas, whatever, the majority sort of like ideals, interpersonal, so person to person, and then like institutional, and I think the other one is organizational. But I think so often people want to focus on those institutional policies and we don't want to focus on the attitudes. So anything that we implement without also simultaneously taking a deep dive into those racist attitudes, those supremacist attitudes that maintain these systems, it's performative. And so again, I talk to educators about this all the time. You're bringing in all these diverse students, you're bringing in diverse peoples to the workplace. Are you bringing them into a place where they feel included? Are you bringing them into a place where they feel safe? If you just bring people in and don't change anything about your culture except maybe sending out a Black History Month email, that's not helpful. And that's not making me feel included. And so I think that, again, a lot of people don't want to hear this because a lot of people don't want to acknowledge that their attitudes may be are maintaining these systems. And so what I've definitely been trying to push in my consultations, in my consulting work is, okay, we have to do both of these things and we have to do them consistently. I don't want to come in here for one training and then it's over. What is that about to do? That ain't about to do nothing. And so it's kind of like, we have to, again, I think simultaneously, as President Biden says, walk and chew gum at the same time, focus on our policies and those things and these underlying attitudes that have maintained these systems. Like, again, as we talked about, it's so pervasive. We need a pervasive solution. Good question. Others?
Might I ask a question? I was waiting to see if one came out of the chat.
Please
There is
do.
one more in the chat at the moment.
Please take the chat question. I'll come back.
All right. All right, so this question asks, people are using the term white privilege a lot these days. Do you believe there is truly an understanding or just an attempt to appear empathetic while not bringing any more unwanted media attention?
These questions are dope. I do think that I'm going to answer like a therapist and say it depends. I do think that there are some allies out there that understand the pervasiveness of privilege and how far it extends. I also think there are some people that will say like, yeah, white privilege is a thing, but not for me because I was poor when I grew up, or, you know, my parents got a divorce, I struggled. And I think that white privilege doesn't insinuate that you didn't struggle. It insinuates that your struggle was not due to your skin color. And so I think that I would like to, I'm just very cynical. So I feel like people don't understand, but I don't want to say that no one understands. I do think that there are allies, there are people out here that are out here, you know, fighting the fight and spreading the word, that are trying to communicate that message that privilege is not only for people who are rich. Privilege is not, you know, white privilege is just that. So that's what I would say to that. These questions are dope.
Is there another question in the chat?
There is.
Go ahead.
We're
And
gonna
I'll
keep-
go after this one. I'll go.
Yep. So you've provided so many excellent resources in this talk. Are there resources you can recommend about oppression in higher education specifically?
So if you're asking for faculty, there's a book called, what's it called? Racial Battle Fatigue in Faculty. I think that's a good one for anyone working in higher education institutions. Let me consult my list. Hold on one moment. I can put this list or the link to this list in the chat as well. A lot of the educational resources I have talk about K through 12 specifically, but I think they can be generalized. So I can't share a file in here, can I? Just links.
Just links at the moment, but there are people directly that are asking. We can route you to them directly.
Okay, so I'll put 2 links in the chat here. The first will just be the to the main resource list that I showed, and then the second will be to the one specific to education. Maybe. Just kidding. Oh, there it is. Okay, so here's the first one. And this is just the general list. I'm sorry, these links are like super long. And then this second one, and this again, the second one will be more specific to education. So hopefully those work for you and those provide some resources.
And for those of you on YouTube, I'm going to put those links in the comments on the YouTube page.
Other questions, comments, concerns?
So I'm going to go ahead and go.
Yeah, after you, Scott, there's a raised hand also.
Okay. And I apologize for not typing this in the chat, but I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to say, but I think I have an idea, and it would have taken me forever. So thank you for your fantastic talk. As you know, what I like to do is try to pull threads, develop threads between the talks that we've had. So in mine, I talked a lot about infrastructures of suffering and how these infrastructures give rise and perpetuate cognitive mechanisms that lead to people ignoring those who they're leaving out. When we talked to Dr. Paris last week, she talked about empathy in relation to dealing or treating those who have been traumatized. And you addressed both in your talk. And you mentioned having to do many things at the same time. And I agree completely. And I just want to ask your opinion on certain things that people might think are strategies at the moment. So for example, the discussion about this issue right now is being handled, I'm not going to say largely, but quite influentially by private industry. So there are a lot of commercials out there now with biracial couples, all these things that the private industry is doing. And what I'm wondering is how do those things work, or do they make things worse? In other words, in relation to your comment earlier about you can't watch TV, you can't. I'm just curious because in my talk I went on a little bit of a rant about a particular Super Bowl commercial, but I'm just curious how you feel about doing these different things, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, I absolutely think, again, it depends, because I do feel like for some people there is value in seeing your likeness represented, or even just like not seeing white people all the time, like in commercials. Like I love going to Target now because I'm like, oh my gosh, look at all these people. Well, Target was already ahead of the game, but I feel like there is value in that. I also think for a number of people who have been fighting the fight forever, it's annoying, because again, thank you for putting those biracial people on TV. Now, why don't you put your organizational structure on TV? Put them CEOs up there. Put that executive suite up there. Is it going to be equally as diverse? Absolutely not. So come back and talk to me when it is. And so I think that, again, there is value in, again, seeing your likeness and even having images like that that spark conversation. Sometimes it's just terrible conversation where people's just racism really comes out. Like, what? You remember that Campbell soup commercial with the two men in it and people just like lost their, you know what I'm saying? Like it was just a whole situation. And so I think that sometimes there are negative effects. I do think that, again, that's what I would say. I think there's a sort of spectrum of validity or value, I would say, on the one end being like, again, someone seeing their likeness on TV, or in, in these spaces. I think on the other end, it's like, I don't give a damn about that. And I don't care about these commercials. Like, what are you actually doing? Because that person, that commercial is not helping me feel less oppressed. What are you actually doing? What opportunities are you actually providing? And what attitudes are actually changing? Because anybody can put something in a commercial because it's in vogue. When it's not, are you still going to be doing that? Is your organizational structure still going to look like it does? Probably. So that's what I'd say.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Here's another question from the chat. And it says, can you provide resources for white social workers working with kids of color? And this person goes on to reply that they often find colleagues don't have the understanding of racism or oppression. They often put assessments in place that don't help families of color.
Ooh, yes. So there are a couple books on that educational list. And again, I know that they're specific to education, but there's one that it's like for white folks who teach in the hood. I think that is a good example. Another one, I'm trying to think, I just saw one, I put it on my Amazon list. I'll get back to you. I'm going to look at my Amazon list, but there's actually a book I just put on my to read list about the IQ test and how it was developed, and it's like super racist, and it talks about just like testing in general and how that's not made for us. And so please remind me before we go, like I'll check that list and get that name for you. But I think any of those anti-racism like book sources that talk about like again, just the experience of people of color in this country, I think that is what people need to be consuming themselves with, and supplement that with, again, those books that are about whiteness and how, again, whiteness attributes to this. Because I think sometimes when people just read about the struggle, it's easy to distance yourself, like, oh, but that wasn't me though. And when you sort of couple that with experiential activities, but also reading books about whiteness, you're like, no, it is you. So it's all of our responsibility to sort of work towards eradicating it. I hope that's helpful. Whoever had that question, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, my name is Chris. Hi, Dr. Hintz. Just a question about kind of white allyship. I was thinking about kind of how segregation and housing segregation. I'm from Western Wisconsin, Eau Claire. Had a couple of Black folks in my high school. Took me to a couple different places in the country, Pittsburgh, to start interacting with people that were not white. So that connection with empathy, like it seemed like I needed to have intimate people in my life before it moved me to care. And I feel embarrassed about that. I'm like why, a movie couldn't do that, a bunch of books couldn't do that, but I needed like cared people, if that makes any sense, like in my life. And so I don't know if that's on any of these like white ally developmental things, but in my classrooms, that's Between the World and Me. I'm glad you brought up that book. Those stories very emotional to me, with his son and how that white woman treats his son in that book. But yeah, just I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, that white ally and how segregation messes that up, because it seems like I can't. How do I get closer to people I don't know much about, maybe culturally?
Yeah, I think I appreciate that, because I think that points to something that happens a lot in our segregated nation, right? There are people who live in these homogenous communities. So it's like, I've never seen Black people, I've never seen anyone, maybe the two people that, you know what I'm saying, were down the street, whatever, So I think that that's not uncommon. And I think that for me in this year of 2021, like understanding that there are other people in the world is like, it's impossible not to, like, because, you know, turn on the TV, you know, whatever. And I do think though that what you're pointing to is, again, making that sort of human connection with it, right? Because again, reading a book, watching a movie, there's a level of separation there. And that's why I feel like we have to accompany all of those things with experiential exercises. So again, when it's safe to do so, being able to put yourself in situations that maybe you would not have been in. So whether that's going to like a larger city and going to a museum, or going to a larger city and going to a festival, something like that, in which you can sort of immerse yourself in it. Because again, I think that that is also being able to be in a homogenous community forever and ever, and never have to consider or confront systems of oppression and privilege, is an agent of privilege. And so again, that is so often I'm in spaces where I hear people say something like, oh my gosh, this is so hard. Like, I don't think I can do this. Again, that's an agency of privilege, right? To say like, ooh, thinking about all of this and thinking about what we're going to do, that's a lot. Like, I don't want to do that. Okay, I'll just continue to suffer then while you sit over there and think about how it's so difficult. You know what I'm saying? And so I feel like sometimes, and again, that's no fault of yours that you're from a homogenous community. Absolutely not. And so I think that, again, that's where the responsibility falls on people in those situations to sort of not just read, not just watch, not just listen, but experience and find that connection. Like we talked about that 3-level model of identity, find that existential connection. Because again, you know, it's going to be like apples to oranges comparing your experience, but existentially, I can understand what sadness is. And so maybe I can connect with you in that way. Does that make sense?
No, it's funny you mentioned that, because for me, I grew up in the Lutheran pew, you know, thinking about Wisconsin. And so it's interesting. Sometimes I connect over spiritual things, where in academia, it kind of feels like that's not really a space that that identity I share at all. Mm-hmm. But I have shared it in other spaces with non-white folk around, those things. Because I know the stories. I know, you know, just you're sitting in a pew that long, you just know the story. So
yes, I dig it. And I think that's another important testament to intersectionality, right? Because again, race is not the only group identity characteristics that can unite or divide us. Spirituality is one, socioeconomic status is one, geekdom, I would argue, is one. That's why I'm sitting here, because Scott and I share in that. That's why I'm having this conversation right now. And so there are so many other things. I think race is just one that has been perpetual for so long, and that it causes so much damage in our country and to people in our country for far too long. Others?
See, I'm not seeing anything new in either the chat or YouTube at this point. And I know we are coming up.
I just wanted to like, it's kind of a question, but it's more a comment. Being a new therapist in the field, coming out of social work school, I noticed that, well, I went to a HBCU for my undergrad, but for graduate school, I went to a PWI, predominantly white institution. And so I got to see both sides of my education from the HBCU and then graduate school. But I guess what started to concern me most is after I got my social work degree and became licensed, and it's time for me to practice my therapy, I'm learning that there's all these certifications and other modalities that I didn't have access to. And so when I go into some of these spaces, I'm like the only Black there, or they're saying that they're trying now to have a diverse crowd. And I wanted to understand, why didn't you have it all along? If you have clients that are diverse, why aren't the modalities, why don't Black clinicians have access to these modalities? Because I know some of them can be very expensive, $2,000, $3,000, DBT, CBT. but why don't we have access? And we're serving clients too. So it hit me on another level when I got out here to try to help. And I'm open to help in any culture, but I predominantly work with kids in the inner city. So I'm trying to find modalities, and some of that don't apply to my, it's not applicable.
Yes, and I think what you're pointing to is like a whole nother dissertation about how psychology is so white and how it is definitely rooted in white Eurocentric values. And so even the concepts of normality, the concepts of abnormality, diagnoses, them wasn't made for all people. And so I think that, and particularly in psychology and sort of counseling and social work education, for far too long, issues of diversity and culture have been treated as auxiliary. Like, oh, if it's a person of color, let's talk about culture. Nah, first of all, we need to always be talking about that. But also it's just like, when it's treated as, like you said, like in training, it's treated as like, oh, let's just add that diversity class and then y'all be good. Whereas that's not, when you working with particularly marginalized youth, but marginalized people in general, we can't remove all those intersectionalities. And so the fact that in training programs, people are not getting this is just, it really is a disservice. And that's why so many people of color underutilize outpatient services, because they're not going to providers that are like culturally responsive. And so why am I going to enter into a vulnerable space with you when you just microaggress me like 32 times? Like, no, thank you. And then I think that sort of the other piece that you're speaking to is just the equitable nature of counseling, psychology, and social work. I don't have $3,000 and I'm a whole doctor because I have $9 million worth of student loans. And so what are we doing to try to reduce those inequities? And again, oftentimes in those spaces, people are like, well, you shouldn't have took out those loans. I'm sorry, I don't have a rich parent. You know what I'm saying? I appreciate that. Thank you so much for that comment. Because again, that could be a whole other situation, a whole other discussion.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, so if there aren't any other questions, we're probably going to start wrapping it up. And I'm going to announce the two next talks, not the two final talks, but the two next talks that are coming up. First of all, shout out to my HBCU sister over there. Shout out to you. So the next two talks coming up, first one being on March 23rd from 7 to 8:30, same time. In our project are Anna George from Oxford University and Eric Weisselman, PhD from Illinois. Is that Illinois State University? Yes. And it's entitled Reducing the Moral Empathy Gap Within Political Conversation. And then following that one, we'll have Dr. Dan Lannon from the Department of Psychology here at Illinois State University delivering a talk called Exercising Empathy, Strengthening Our Ability to Emphasize Effectively. And that's on Tuesday, April 13th. So there's a little break. We've been going back to back weeks. So there's a break week in between the next two talks. So, and I also wanted to thank you, Dr. Vanessa Hintz, for coming and doing your talk tonight. I learned quite a bit. I just want to let you know that every time I turned my camera up, I was busy taking pictures of things that you were saying. And I also send you a picture of you talking later on. But it was fire. Thank you so much for being honest and open. I'm learning so much from you about just doing the honest and real talk. And that's where we need to be right now. So I certainly appreciate everything you say. And I'm sure everyone else here also appreciates it. So Dr. Jordan, do you have anything else?
I think I saw Montine Miller with the hand raised. If she'd like to come in and ask a question to close the evening, please do. If I've put you on the spot and embarrassed you, I apologize, but I want everybody to be able to take advantage of Dr. Hintz's wisdom.
Montine said that was an accident.
Oh, all right. Well, then I have nothing to say, but thank you for such a fantastic talk. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight. And please join us next time. Come to these next talks. We love it.
Yes, please. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Dr. Hintz.